Many beginners believe that depth comes from details, but in landscape painting, it actually mostly comes from contrast. So if your paintings are flat, even after you've added the lovely texture and all of those highlights, it's probably just because you're missing one of these three principles. The first is contrast. Now, when we talk about contrast in art, we're just talking about two unlike art elements touching. Think white versus black, textured versus smooth. And we use this to our advantage because our eyes perceive things that are contrasting with the background as closer. And this creates our first layer of depth. So if our foreground is dark and our background is light, then we are going to see good visual contrast. Here's one of my paintings that doesn't have as much contrast as some of my others, but you can see that the mountainside really does contrast the sky, making it look like the mountain is in the front. Next up is atmospheric perspective. Atmospheric perspective has everything to do with how our eyes perceive distance in the real world and mimicking that on a surface. You see, our eyes are very sensitive and they pick up all of the different particles in the air when we're viewing things at a distance. That's why on foggy or misty days, things might seem further away than they actually are compared to a day where it's freshly rained. You see the mountain and it suddenly seems way closer than you remember it being. That has everything to do with the amount of particulates in the air that our eyes perceive, giving us distance. And we can create this same illusion in art using a few simple tricks. The first is we want low contrast in our background. This means that things are going to be very similar in value. We want it to be light and lighter rather than light and dark. We also want it to be very similar to the same color hue as what our sky is. So if you have a blue sky, your mountains are going to be a bit on the bluer, cooler side. Or if it's mist, it's going to be on the grayer side. I think you see where I'm going here. And last but certainly not least, and is incredibly important, is to have less detail in the background. This also makes our eyes not spend as much time in the background and gives us the illusion of depth. And it's one area that I know is really hard for artists not to dive into, because who doesn't love a bit of detail? Here's a good example of what atmospheric perspective looks like in my own work. This is a painting I've done from a few years ago. You can see that the mountains are very far in the back and we're working our way almost layered in space, where we start with this kind of blue-gray wash, and as we get closer we start to pick up more colors like the greens and the fall colors as we make our way to the front. So that's atmospheric perspective. And last but certainly not least is intentional layering. What I mean by this is most landscape painters are going to work background to foreground. And the reason for this is our eyes are incredibly sensitive. Like they pick up the particulates for atmospheric perspective, they also pick up overlaps in paint. Which means if you accidentally slightly overlap your sky because maybe you needed to fix something over maybe one of your mountain peaks, your brain is going to pick that up and immediately flatten out space, which is why we want our paint to intentionally layer over the top of each other, because our brains pick that up really quickly. A good example of where we see this rule broken pretty regularly is actually with the famous artist Vincent van Gogh, who has very often and very intentionally done his foreground or subject matter first and then does his background afterwards, which is why his paintings look relatively flat. Colorful, beautiful, but maybe not so much depth. So now when you combine contrast with a little bit of atmospheric perspective and throw in some intentional layering, you should have a painting that has more believable depth and should not feel flat. If you'd like to practice some of these principles with me, I am teaching a class on March 7th. I'd love to see you there. There's more information in the description below. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in my comment section. I'm happy to answer them as they come up. Happy painting! I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.